The Valkar Empire had conquered 43 star systems in less than a decade, and their military doctrine was simple, brutal, and effective, overwhelming force applied without mercy. When they arrived at the borders of human space, they expected the same terrified surrender they had received from every other species in the galaxy. They had studied the humans from a distance, analyzing their technology, their military capabilities, their political structures. Everything pointed to an easy conquest. The humans used chemical propulsion for their smaller craft, relied on projectile weapons instead of energy-based systems, and their fastest ships could barely achieve .4 light speed. By Valkar standards, they were primitives playing at civilization. Commander Vexthalan stood on the bridge of the warship Eternal Vengeance, his 3 eyes focused on the rotating image of the human colony world designated New Haven. Intelligence reports indicated a population of approximately 200,000, mostly civilian, with minimal military presence. A few orbital platforms for traffic control, some ground-based defensive installations that looked like they had been salvaged from museum pieces, and a small garrison of perhaps 200 soldiers. It was, by any reasonable military assessment, indefensible. The colony had been given the standard ultimatum 72 hours ago: submit to Valkar authority, accept imperial governance, and your people will be allowed to continue their lives under our protection. Refuse, and face complete military suppression. The humans had responded with silence, which Vexthalan interpreted as either stubborn defiance or simply an inability to comprehend the severity of their situation. Deploy invasion forces, Vexthalan ordered, his primary manipulator gesturing toward the tactical display. Standard suppression protocol. I want full occupation within 24 hours. Within hours, 50,000 Valkar shock troops descended upon New Haven in a carefully coordinated operation that had been executed successfully on dozens of worlds. The initial landings met no resistance. Drop ships settled into designated zones throughout the colony's main settlement, disgorging troops that moved with practiced efficiency. The Valkar were veterans, hardened by years of conquest, confident in their superiority. Vexthalan watched the feeds from his troop commanders with growing satisfaction. The human civilians were evacuating ahead of the advancing forces, exactly as expected. There were no military formations, no defensive emplacements being activated, no sign of organized resistance. Another world would fall before nightfall, another conquest to add to the Empire's growing list of victories. Then the humans appeared. They didn't arrive in formation, didn't announce themselves with dramatic declarations or heroic speeches. They simply materialized from the shadows, from rooftops, from underground tunnels that hadn't existed on any scan. The first indication that something was wrong came when Lieutenant Commander Zaxthar, leading the advance element into the colony's commercial district, simply stopped reporting. His entire squad, 23 soldiers, went dark simultaneously. Lieutenant Greg Hammond crouched in the bell tower of what had once been the Colonial Administration Building, a structure that had served as town hall, courthouse, and community center for the past 15 years. His rifle, a weapon that would have seemed archaic to the Valkar with its chemical propellant and mechanical action, rested against his shoulder with the comfortable weight of an old friend. Through his scope, he watched the alien formations spreading through the streets below, their movements confident, almost careless. The Valkar moved like conquerors, not soldiers expecting resistance. They bunched up at intersections, failed to clear buildings before moving past them, and their formation discipline was adequate but not exceptional. Hammond had seen better tactical movement from police academy recruits. These aliens had conquered through overwhelming force and superior technology, not through military excellence. "Command, this is Ghost Lead," he whispered into his comm unit, the encryption making his voice sound slightly distorted even to his own ears. "We have targets. Requesting weapons free." The response came immediately from the underground command post 3 kilometers away, though the voice was calm, almost bored. Colonel Patricia Barnes had been running special operations for 23 years, and this was far from her first rodeo. Ghost lead, you are weapons free, make it count. Copy that. Hammond allowed himself a small smile behind his scope. Ghosts engage at will. Hammond's first shot was a work of art if killing could be considered artistic. He had calculated wind speed, humidity, temperature, even the Coriolis' effect from the planet's rotation. The Valkyr officer he had targeted was giving orders to his squad, gesturing with what passed for hands in his species, when the bullet removed the top third of his skull. The crack of Hammond's rifle reached the aliens 3 seconds later, traveling at a mere 1,200 feet per second compared to the supersonic projectile that had preceded it. By the time that sound wave arrived, 4 more Valkyr had fallen, each shot placed with surgical precision. Hammond wasn't just killing, he was creating chaos, targeting officers and specialists, leaving the grunts leaderless and confused. The Valkyr response was textbook, exactly what their military doctrine prescribed. Take cover, identify the shooter's position through ballistic backplotting, suppress the firing position with overwhelming firepower, then move in for the kill. They had done this 1,000 times on 100 worlds, and it had always worked. But as they moved to execute their training, as energy weapons carved glowing scars into the administration building's stonework, they discovered something terrifying. The human was gone. Staff Sergeant Linda Morris watched through her thermal scope as the Valkyr soldiers frantically searched the building where Hammond had been positioned. She was 2 blocks away now, in an entirely different structure that gave her excellent sight lines on 3 major streets. Through her earpiece, she could hear Hammond setting up his next hide 3 streets over, in the upper floor of what had been a furniture warehouse. The aliens were searching for an enemy who fought by rules they didn't understand. In conventional warfare, you hold ground, you defend positions, you stand and fight. The humans were doing none of these things. They were fighting a guerrilla war, and the Valkyr had no experience with that type of combat. They're bunching up near the central plaza, Linda reported, watching the Valkyr formations converge. In their confusion and fear, they were doing exactly what their training told them to do: consolidate forces, establish a defensive perimeter, wait for orders. I count at least 200 in tight formation. Copy that, came Hammond's reply. Danny, you got that package ready. Corporal Danny Wright sat in a storm drain 50 meters from the plaza, the concrete tunnel barely wide enough for his shoulders. Above him, through 3 inches of permacrete and soil, the Valkyr were walking directly over 20 pounds of human explosive compound, a mixture so sophisticated that their molecular scanners had registered it as nothing more than mineral deposits in the soil. Danny had planted the charges 18 hours ago during the night cycle, working in total darkness with just his hands and his training to guide him. Package is ready, Danny confirmed, his fingers resting lightly on the detonator. On your mark. Mark. Danny pressed the trigger. The explosion tore through the plaza like the fist of an angry god. The shaped charges, positioned with mathematical precision, directed the blast upward into the massed Valkyr formation. Those in the immediate vicinity simply vanished, converted to constituent atoms by temperatures that briefly rivaled the surface of a star. The aliens in the secondary zone fared little better, thrown like broken dolls against buildings and vehicles, their armor providing no protection against kinetic forces that shattered bone and ruptured organs. The shockwave propagated outward, shattering windows 3 blocks away and setting off vehicle alarms throughout the district. Commander Vexthalan watched his casualty reports climb with growing disbelief. 247 dead in a single strike. The enemy force was still listed as 47 humans. The computer had to be malfunctioning. The numbers simply didn't work. In every military engagement in Valkyr history, casualties were proportional to force size and technology levels. A force of 47 should not be able to inflict such losses. All forces converge on the human positions, he ordered, his voice carrying an edge of desperation that his subordinates had never heard before. Crush them with numbers. They cannot hide from tens of thousands. Sweep every building, every tunnel, every possible hiding place. His words cut off as 3 of his orbital observation satellites went dark simultaneously. In the void above New Haven, Chief Petty Officer Kate Sullivan, was already programming the next intercept course into her stealth fighter, a craft so covered in radar, absorbing materials and heat-dissipating systems that it was effectively invisible to anything short of direct visual observation. The Valkyr satellites had been easy targets, their hulls designed to deflect energy weapons, but utterly unprepared for the kinetic kill vehicle she had launched. There was no explosion, no dramatic flash of light, just a chunk of dense metal traveling at a significant fraction of light speed, its impact converting both projectile and target into expanding clouds of superheated gas. "Command, this is Wraith 1, Kate reported, her voice carrying the slight echo of someone speaking through a pressure suit. "Enemy orbital assets neutralized. They're blind up here." On the ground, the Valkyr were learning the same lesson about visibility. They couldn't see their enemy. Their thermal scanners picked up ghost images that vanished when pursued, phantom heat signatures that led squads into kill zones and ambushes. Their motion detectors screamed warnings about threats that melted away like smoke. Their audio sensors were overwhelmed by the echo and reverberation of urban combat, unable to distinguish real sounds from decoys and misdirection. And all the while, their soldiers kept dying. Sergeant Pete Donovan had been a hunter before he joined the military, stalking deer through the forests of Montana with a rifle his grandfather had given him. He had learned patience in those forests, learned to move silently, learned to read terrain and anticipate the movements of his prey. The Valkyr, he decided as he watched them through his scope, were easier prey than white-tailed deer. They made noise when they moved, didn't watch their backtrail, and bunched up when they got scared. He had killed 17 of them in the past 2 hours, and not one had seen him coming. Pete moved through the ruins of what had been a shopping district, his footsteps silent despite the rubble-strewn floor. Ahead, he could hear Valkyr voices, harsh and clicking in their native tongue. They were arguing about something, probably trying to figure out where the next attack would come from, which direction held death and which held temporary safety. He settled into a firing position behind a collapsed wall, checked his sight picture, controlled his breathing. Patience. The Valkyr would move eventually, and when they did, they would expose themselves to his line of fire. Sure enough, after several minutes of heated discussion, 3 of them emerged from cover, moving in what they probably thought was a tactical formation. Their spacing was adequate, their weapons were oriented correctly, their movement was deliberate. Pete's rifle coughed 3 times, each shot separated by perhaps 2 seconds. 3 aliens fell. The rest of the squad erupted from their position, firing wildly in Pete's general direction, their energy weapons carving glowing gouges in the concrete and metal. By the time their fire actually targeted his location with any accuracy, Pete was already gone, moving through a pre-planned escape route that took him through a series of connected buildings, through holes in walls that had been carefully prepared weeks ago during the evacuation. The Valkyr found nothing but empty rooms, 3 spent shell casings, and the growing certainty that they were fighting an enemy that operated by completely different rules than anything they had encountered before. As night fell over New Haven, the Valkyr learned to fear the darkness. Their night vision equipment was excellent, their thermal sensors were top of the line, but somehow the humans moved through the shadows like they were born to it. Commander Vexthaland stared at casualty reports that made no sense. His invasion force had lost over 3,000 soldiers in less than 12 hours. The human defenders had lost 0. Not a single confirmed kill. His troops were terrified, reporting that the humans appeared and disappeared like demons, that they struck without warning and vanished without trace, that nowhere was safe. "Request reinforcements," he finally admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "And bring in the heavy armor. If we cannot find them, we will simply destroy every structure where they might hide." The reinforcements arrived within 12 hours. Another 20,000 troops and a full armored division, 42 heavy tanks and 63 armored personnel carriers. The strategy was simple brutality. If the humans wanted to hide in the ruins, the Valkyr would turn the entire city into a crater, would reduce every building to rubble, would eliminate every possible hiding place through sheer destructive power. The tanks rolled through the streets at dawn, their main guns tracking for targets, their heavy armor seemingly proof against the primitive projectile weapons the humans favored. Each tank was a mobile fortress, weighing nearly 70 tons, armed with energy weapons capable of melting through reinforced concrete like butter. Their crews were confident, secure in their armored shells, certain that these lightly armed humans could not possibly threaten such massive machines. Lieutenant Amy Chen watched the Valkyr armor column from her position in an underground command post that had once been the colony's emergency management center. Beside her, Warrant Officer Frank Miller was making final adjustments to the targeting computer they had assembled from parts that looked like they belonged in a museum. The system was entirely mechanical, with no electronic signature that the Valkyr could detect, using nothing more sophisticated than mirrors, lenses, and hand calculations. "You know," Frank said conversationally as he turned another calibration dial, "when I joined Special Forces, I thought I'd be jumping out of perfectly good aircraft and shooting bad guys in exotic locations. Nobody mentioned I'd be doing artillery calculations in a basement using equipment from the pre-digital era." Amy grinned despite the tension. "Where's your sense of adventure, Frank? We're about to turn 20 million credit war machines into scrap metal using weapons that predate faster than light travel. This is living history." "Fair point." Frank pressed the final sequence into the mechanical calculator. "Firing solution locked. You want to do the honors." Amy reached for the trigger mechanism, a simple mechanical switch that would have looked primitive to anyone from an advanced species. It was connected by wire, actual copper wire, to firing mechanisms buried in the street. No radio signals to intercept, no electronic emissions to detect, just good old-fashioned electrical current flowing through metal. "Command, this is Hammer 1, engaging armor." The first indication the Valkyr had that something was wrong was when the lead tank simply stopped moving. The second indication was when it exploded from the inside. The shaped charge that had been buried in the street beneath it, designed specifically to punch through the vulnerable underside of armored vehicles. The jet of superheated metal created by the explosion carved through the tank's belly armor like a knife through paper, turning the interior into a blast furnace that incinerated the crew instantly. The third indication was when the same thing happened to 6 more tanks in rapid succession, each one positioned over a carefully buried mine that the Valkyr had driven right over without detecting. The Valkyr armor column ground to a halt, their commanders suddenly realizing they were driving through a minefield that somehow hadn't appeared on any of their scans. What they couldn't realize, was that the mines hadn't been there when they scanned. The humans had been laying them in real time, slipping between the Valkyr patrols like ghosts, burying their surprises in the path of the advancing armor, working through the night while the aliens huddled in their defensive positions. Staff Sergeant Kyle Roberts had personally placed 13 of the mines currently tearing through the Valkyr column. He watched from a safe distance from the 3rd floor of a building that gave him excellent observation as the aliens tried to reorganize, their formation broken, their confidence shattered. Then he picked up his radio and sent a simple message. "Ghosts are clear. Light them up." What the Valkyr couldn't have known because their intelligence gathering had been so inadequate, was that while their attention had been focused on the ground troops and the mysterious mines, the humans had been busy in other ways. Every rooftop, every upper floor window, every elevated position now hosted a human with a launcher. The sky filled with contrails as dozens of anti-armor missiles streaked toward the Valkyr column. These weren't sophisticated guided munitions with artificial intelligence targeting systems. They were relatively simple rockets with shaped charges, weapons that any industrial civilization could manufacture with basic technology. But they were guided by human eyes and human hands, operators who had trained for years to put warheads on target, and they struck with devastating precision. Some of the missiles were intercepted by the tank's point defense systems, burst apart by defensive fire, their warheads detonating harmlessly in mid-air. But there were too many, coming from too many directions, and the Valkyr defensive systems were designed to handle one or two threats at a time, not dozens of simultaneous attacks. Missiles slammed into tank turrets, into the thinner side armor, into the vulnerable rear sections where engines and ammunition were stored. Each impact was a precisely calculated blow designed to exploit specific weak points in the Valkyr armor design. The humans had studied these tanks, had analyzed their construction, had identified every vulnerability. In less than 3 minutes, the Valkyr armored division ceased to exist as a fighting force. Those tanks that weren't outright destroyed were disabled, their tracks blown off, their weapons systems shattered, their crews either dead or abandoning their vehicles in panic. And before the stunned Valkyr infantry could respond, before they could organize a counterattack or even process what had just happened, the humans vanished again, melting into the ruins like they had never been there. Commander Vexthaland felt something he had not experienced in his entire military career: genuine fear. Not fear of death in battle, which was an honorable thing, but fear of an enemy he could not understand, could not predict, could not defeat through any method in his tactical playbook. The humans fought with inferior technology, were vastly outnumbered, should by all logical analysis have been crushed in the first hour of combat. Yet they were winning. They were destroying his forces piece by piece, engagement by engagement, and there seemed to be nothing he could do to stop it. Analysis, he demanded of his intelligence officer. How are they doing this? What tactical principle are we missing? His intelligence officer, a veteran of dozens of campaigns who had studied military theory at the Empire's finest academies, studied the tactical displays with an expression that might have been admiration on a human face. The data told a story, and it was not a story the Valkyr had ever encountered before. Commander, they are not fighting to win territory. They are not attempting to hold ground or defend specific positions. They are fighting purely to inflict casualties while minimizing their own exposure. Every engagement is designed to maximize our losses and eliminate any possibility of retaliation. They strike and fade, never allowing us to bring our superior numbers to bear. Cowardice, Vexthaland spat, though the word carried less conviction than he had intended. They hide like prey animals, afraid to face us in honest battle. No, Commander. The intelligence officer looked up from his displays, his 3 eyes meeting Vexthaland's with uncomfortable directness. They are not hiding like prey animals. They are hunting like apex predators, and we, I am afraid, are the prey. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. In 3 decades of military service, Vexthaland had never considered the possibility that his forces might be prey rather than predators. The Valkyr Empire was the hunter. Other species were the hunted. That was the natural order of the galaxy. Apparently, the humans had not received that memo. As days turned into weeks, the truth of the intelligence officer's assessment became undeniable. The Valkyr force, which had landed with such confidence, with such certainty of victory, was being systematically dismantled. Not in glorious battle, not in dramatic confrontations where courage and skill determined the outcome, but in 1,000 small engagements where the humans held every advantage. The Valkyr learned to fear the night, when human operators moved with impunity through darkness that their thermal sensors couldn't penetrate effectively. The humans used cooling suits that masked their heat signatures, moved through underground tunnels that honeycombed the colony, employed decoys and misdirection that turned every sensor reading into a potential trap. They learned to fear the day, when human snipers picked off officers and communications specialists from distances that should have been impossible with primitive projectile weapons. The humans compensated for wind, humidity, temperature, even the planet's rotation, putting bullets through targets at ranges that exceeded anything the Valkyr had thought possible with chemical propulsion. They learned to fear the rain, because the humans had learned to use the precipitation to mask their movements and their heat signatures, using the weather as a tactical advantage in ways the Valkyr had never considered. Most of all, they learned to fear the silence, because when it was quiet, when nothing was happening, that was when the humans were planning their next strike, moving into position, preparing another devastating blow. Captain Brian Hayes led a 6-person team through the Valkar supply depot on the outskirts of the occupied zone. The aliens had thought this facility was secure, had protected it with force fields and automated defenses, and enough guards to repel any conventional assault. They hadn't counted on humans who were willing to spend 3 days crawling through drainage pipes to get inside their perimeter, who would lie in sewage and filth for hours waiting for patrol patterns to repeat, who treated discomfort and misery as just another part of the job. "Annie, how much time do we have?" Brian whispered, his voice barely audible even though his teammate was less than 2 meters away. Specialist Annie Davis checked her chronometer, the old-fashioned mechanical type that didn't emit any electronic signature. "Patrol comes back through in 9 minutes. We need to be clear in 7. "Roger that. Plant the charges and let's move." They worked with the efficiency of a team that had trained together for years, each member knowing their role without needing instructions. Explosive packages went into carefully calculated positions throughout the supply depot, not random destruction but surgical strikes designed to create maximum secondary explosions when the fuel cells and ammunition stores cooked off. "Last one set," reported Corporal Victor Price, the team's demolitions expert. "Timers are synced. We are good to go." The team extracted the same way they had entered, through pipes and conduits that the Valkar hadn't even considered as potential infiltration routes. The aliens were used to fighting species that attacked directly, that valued honor and glory in combat. They had no experience with an enemy that would crawl through sewage to accomplish their mission. They were 2 kilometers away, safely outside the blast radius, when Brian triggered the detonator. Even at that distance, the explosion was spectacular. The supply depot, which had contained enough ammunition and provisions to support the Valkar invasion for 6 months, ceased to exist in a rolling cascade of detonations that lit up the night sky like a newborn star. Secondary explosions continued for nearly 20 minutes as stored ammunition cooked off, each burst sending more fire and shrapnel into the air. In orbit, Commander Vexthalan watched his logistics chain evaporate and made a decision that would have been unthinkable 3 weeks ago. He had been sent to conquer this world, to bring it under Imperial control, to demonstrate Valkar superiority. Instead, he was presiding over a disaster, watching his forces being destroyed by an enemy a fraction of their size. It was time to negotiate. He opened a communication channel to the Human Colony Administration, the same officials he had dismissed as primitive and irrelevant when he first arrived, the same people he had given an ultimatum with such confidence. "This is Commander Vexthalan of the Valkar Empire, requesting negotiation of terms." There was a pause, several seconds of silence during which Vexthalan wondered if the humans would simply refuse to respond, would leave him and his shattered forces to their fate. Then a voice came through, calm and professional. "Commander, this is Governor Paul Mitchell. We are willing to discuss terms of your withdrawal." "Withdrawal?" Vexthalan felt his crest flatten in shock. The humans weren't offering to negotiate surrender terms or occupation conditions. They were demanding that he leave. "You would dare to demand?" "Commander," the governor interrupted, his voice still calm but carrying an edge of steel beneath the courtesy. "Let me be completely clear about your tactical situation. You came to our world with 70,000 troops, superior technology, and a full armored division. Our latest intelligence assessment puts your effective fighting force at approximately 32,000 effectives, with negligible armor support and critically degraded supply lines. Your orbital assets are neutralized, your command and control is disrupted, and you are facing an enemy that you cannot see, cannot target, and cannot defeat through conventional military operations." There was another pause, and when the governor continued, his voice was almost gentle, the tone of someone explaining an unfortunate reality to a child. "Commander, you have been engaged by 47 members of our Special Operations Forces, just 47 operators, representing a tiny fraction of our military capability. Would you like to know how many more we have?" Vexthalan felt his throat constrict, felt the primal fear of prey realizing it has been caught by a superior predator. "How many?" That information is classified for obvious security reasons, but I can tell you this. The teams currently operating on New Haven represent less than 1% of our special operations capability. Less than 1%, Commander. And they are having what they consider a relatively easy time of it, operating in familiar terrain against an enemy with no experience in asymmetric warfare. The words hung in the void like a death sentence. Less than 1%. The humans had barely tried, had sent a token force, and they had crushed the Valkar invasion like an afterthought. "What are your terms?" Vexthalan asked, the words coming out with difficulty through a throat that felt like it was closing. "Complete and immediate withdrawal from New Haven and all human colonies. Full reparations for damages inflicted during your invasion. And most importantly, Commander, you will return to your empire with a message. The human race does not seek conflict with the Valkar or any other species. We prefer peace and mutually beneficial trade relationships, but we are prepared for war in ways that you clearly cannot imagine. You have faced our special forces operating under strict rules of engagement designed to minimize casualties. Pray that you never face our regular military operating without those restraints." Commander Vexthalan agreed to the terms. He had no choice. The alternative was to continue a war he could not win, to watch his forces be destroyed piece by piece until nothing remained. As his shattered force prepared for evacuation, as his remaining troops withdrew from a colony they had expected to conquer in a day, he compiled a detailed report for the Valkar High Command. The report detailed every engagement, every casualty, every tactical lesson learned at such terrible cost. It described how 47 humans had destroyed an invasion force through superior tactics, intimate knowledge of their terrain, and a willingness to fight with what the Valkar considered primitive weapons employed in ways that were anything but primitive. But the most important part of the report was the final section, which Vexthalan wrote personally, without input from his staff, based solely on his own hard-won understanding. The humans possess a warrior class they refer to as special forces. These individuals do not fight with honor or glory in the traditional sense that we understand those concepts. They fight to win, using any method, any tactic, any weapon that achieves their objective. They are patient beyond measure, capable of waiting days or weeks for the perfect moment to strike. They are precise beyond belief, placing shots and explosives with surgical accuracy. They are utterly ruthless in the application of force, showing no hesitation or mercy when engaging military targets. In 3 weeks of sustained combat operations, they suffered 0 casualties, while inflicting losses that effectively destroyed our invasion force. They operate in small teams requiring minimal support, can sustain operations indefinitely in hostile territory using only what they can carry or scavenge, and demonstrate a level of tactical innovation that suggests each operator is empowered to make independent decisions rather than following rigid doctrine. Intelligence suggests that the forces we encountered represent a tiny fraction of their special operations capability, and that these special forces are themselves only a small part of their overall military establishment. Recommendation: avoid conflict with humanity at all costs. If conflict becomes unavoidable through political necessity, do not deploy conventional forces. The humans have developed tactical and operational methods that make conventional warfare obsolete when fighting on their own terms. The report spread through the Valkar Empire like wildfire, copied and distributed despite classification restrictions, discussed in military academies and strategic planning sessions. And from there it spread to other spacefaring species, to the great empires and small confederations, to anyone with an interest in galactic politics and military affairs. Within a year, human space was surrounded by a buffer zone that no hostile force dared to cross. The great empires of the galaxy, species who had conquered hundreds of worlds, who possessed technology that made human equipment look like stone tools, gave humanity a wide berth based solely on what had happened on New Haven. They had seen what human special forces could do. They had no desire to discover what humanity's regular military was capable of. On New Haven, Life slowly returned to normal. The ruins were cleared one building at a time, reconstruction crews working around the clock to repair the damage. The buildings were rebuilt with the same determination that had defended them. The mines were carefully removed from the streets by specialists who knew exactly where they had been placed, and the population began trickling back from the evacuation sites. The 47 men and women who had defended the colony returned to their daily lives, or at least attempted to. Most of them went back to working regular jobs, raising families, being ordinary citizens. But they carried with them the knowledge of what they had done, the weight of lives taken and battles won. Lieutenant Greg Hammond, back home in Nebraska and working as a high school teacher, would smile when students asked if he had seen combat during his military service. "Once or twice," he would say with characteristic understatement, and leave it at that. His students didn't need to know that their mild-mannered history teacher had killed more than 40 enemy soldiers in 3 weeks, that he could calculate bullet trajectories in his head faster than most people could use a computer, that he still sometimes woke up in the middle of the night checking sight lines and calculating fields of fire. Staff Sergeant Linda Morris, who ran a small bakery in Oregon, kept her rifle from New Haven in a locked case in her bedroom. She hadn't fired it since that day, but she kept it clean and ready, checking and rechecking the mechanisms with the same care she applied to her baking, just in case. Her customers loved her cinnamon rolls and had no idea that the woman making them had once held off an entire enemy platoon for 6 hours using nothing but a rifle and an intimate knowledge of urban combat. Corporal Danny Wright went back to college, studying engineering with the same precision he had once applied to placing explosives. His professors thought him exceptionally talented at calculating blast radii and structural weaknesses, at understanding how buildings and bridges would fail under stress. They had no idea why he possessed such specific knowledge, why he could look at a structure and immediately identify its critical support points. Chief Petty Officer Kate Sullivan returned to flying commercial shuttles between Earth and the outer colonies, piloting passenger vessels through the black with the same precision she had once used to hunt enemy satellites. Passengers who knew her service record, who recognized the unit patches and campaign ribbons, sometimes asked if she missed the excitement of combat. She would look at them with eyes that had seen orbital warfare, that had watched enemy craft disintegrate under her fire, and smile. "Every day is exciting when you know how to appreciate it," she would say, which was true enough. Flying was still flying, whether you were hauling passengers or hunting targets. And in the archives of every major government in the galaxy, in the classified sections that only the highest officials could access, there were files on humanity. Detailed analyses of the New Haven incident, studies of human military doctrine, psychological profiles attempting to understand how such a primitive species could be so terrifyingly effective at organized violence. The files all reached the same conclusion, stated in different ways but expressing the same fundamental truth. Humanity had evolved on a death world where survival meant constant adaptation and innovation. Earth, by galactic standards, was an insanely hostile environment, a planet where apex predators hunted apex predators, where disease and disaster could strike without warning, where the very climate fluctuated between extremes that would have sterilized most worlds. Humanity had not just survived on Earth. They had thrived, had climbed to the top of the food chain through intelligence, cooperation, and the ability to use tools to overcome physical limitations. They had spent millions of years learning to hunt as a pack, to communicate and coordinate, to plan attacks and organize defenses, to be patient because wasted effort meant starvation and impulsive action meant death. And then humanity had taken those instincts, those deeply ingrained patterns of behavior refined by eons of evolution, and applied them to warfare. The result was special forces, humans who could operate alone or in small groups, who could survive indefinitely in hostile territory using only their wits and their training, who could turn any environment into a weapon and any disadvantage into an opportunity. They were the ultimate expression of humanity's evolutionary heritage. the apex predator refined and armed with technology that made them exponentially more dangerous than their ancestors. The galaxy had been conquered and reconquered by species with superior technology, overwhelming numbers, and ruthless efficiency. But humanity brought something different to warfare. The patience of the persistent hunter who could track prey for days until it collapsed from exhaustion, the adaptability of the omnivore who could eat almost anything to survive, the creativity of the tool user who could fashion weapons from the most unlikely materials, and the social cohesion of the pack hunter who would risk death to protect the group. Admiral Susan Clark stood in the memorial park built on the site of New Haven's Central Plaza, where the Valkar had suffered their first major defeat, where the aliens had learned that numbers and technology weren't everything. She was one of the few people who knew the full scope of humanity's military capability, one of the handful of officers with access to the complete strategic planning files, and even she found it somewhat frightening to contemplate. The Special Forces teams that had defended New Haven were good, among the best humanity had to offer. But they were not unique, not singular examples of human capability. Across human space, thousands of such teams trained every day, honing skills that made them as dangerous as any weapon system ever devised. And behind them stood the regular military, millions of men and women with the same evolutionary heritage, the same capacity for adaptive thinking, the same stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Humanity had been late to the galactic stage, had arrived with technology that seemed primitive compared to the great empires. Ships powered by fusion rather than exotic matter, weapons that used chemical propellants rather than directed energy, computers that were mechanical marvels rather than quantum processors. But in the one area that mattered most, in the application of organized violence to achieve strategic objectives, humanity was unmatched. The Valkar learned that lesson on New Haven, learned it in blood and fire and defeat. Other species learned it by observing what happened to the Valkar, by reading the reports and running their own analyses. And across the galaxy, a new understanding emerged, a fundamental recalculation of humanity's place in the cosmic order. Humanity was not to be trifled with, not because they had the biggest ships or the most advanced weapons, not because they controlled the most territory or had the largest population, but because they had something far more dangerous than any technology. They had 10,000 years of organized warfare, of constant conflict and adaptation, of learning and teaching the arts of destruction. They had special forces. The memorial in New Haven's park was deceptively simple, a black granite wall with 47 names inscribed upon it in clean, elegant lettering. Not the names of the dead, for there were none, but the names of those who had defended the colony. Tourists came from across human space to see it, to touch the names carved in stone, to remember the day when humanity proved that technology wasn't everything, that heart and skill and determination could still win battles. Late one evening, several years after the battle, an old Valkar soldier came to the memorial. His name was Kexthan, and he was one of the few survivors of the original invasion force, one of the lucky ones who had been far from the heaviest fighting when the worst of it happened. He stood before the wall for a long time, reading the names, trying to reconcile the simple list with the devastation it represented. They were so few, he said to Governor Mitchell, who happened to be walking through the park on his evening constitutional. The governor still walked these paths regularly, still touched base with his constituents, still remembered the fear and chaos of those weeks when his world had been invaded. How could so few do so much damage? The governor looked at the memorial, his hand unconsciously reaching out to trace one of the names. Hammond, the young man who had taken the first shot, who had started the battle. He was teaching somewhere on Earth now, if Mitchell's information was current, shaping young minds instead of taking lives. Because they were special, Mitchell said simply. Not because of their equipment or their training, though those things helped tremendously. They were special because of what they were willing to do and what they were willing to sacrifice to protect people they didn't even know personally. That's what makes them special forces. Not the forces part, though they were certainly effective as a fighting unit. the special part, the willingness to put themselves in harm's way for others. The Valkar soldier nodded slowly, his crest rippling in a gesture that indicated deep thought. We have elite troops. Every civilization has elite troops, soldiers who are better trained and equipped than the standard forces. But I have never seen anything like what I saw here. That's because you've never fought humans before, Mitchell said, watching the sun set over the rebuilt city, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded him uncomfortably of fire and explosions. We've been fighting each other for our entire history as a species. We know every trick, every tactic, every dirty strategy because we invented most of them fighting amongst ourselves. When you came here, when you dropped from orbit thinking you would conquer another primitive world, you thought you were fighting a primitive species with outdated technology. What you were actually fighting was 10,000 years of accumulated military knowledge, refined by constant warfare, applied with a cultural value system that prizes individual initiative and adaptive thinking. He paused, gathering his thoughts, trying to articulate something he had spent years contemplating. You weren't defeated by superior technology, soldier. You were defeated by superior tactics employed by warriors who have been perfecting their craft since before your civilization learned to make fire. We've been killing each other for millennia, learning and adapting and innovating, and then we took all that knowledge and pointed it at you. The Valkar stood silent for a long moment, his three eyes reflecting the fading light. What would have happened? He finally asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than hostility, if we had continued fighting, if my commanders had brought our full military might to bear on this world rather than accepting defeat. Governor Mitchell considered the question carefully, knowing that his answer would likely be reported back to Valkar intelligence, might influence future decisions about human-Valkar relations. But honesty seemed like the best policy. You would have lost more thoroughly, and at vastly greater cost to both sides. The teams here were operating under strict rules of engagement designed to minimize civilian casualties and collateral damage. They were trying to defeat you while preserving our infrastructure, protecting our non-combatants, fighting a clean war if such a thing is possible. If you had escalated, if you had targeted civilians or used weapons of mass destruction, those rules would have gone away. And then you would have learned what humanity is truly capable of when we stop being polite and start fighting to exterminate rather than defeat. The Valkar's skin tone shifted to a color that indicated profound unease, perhaps even horror. I am very glad we did not have to learn that lesson. So are we, Mitchell said quietly, meaning it with every fiber of his being. War is always a tragedy, even when necessary. Better that we all learn to respect each other's boundaries without too much bloodshed on either side. Better that we can stand here now, former enemies, and talk like civilized beings rather than continuing to kill each other. As the Valkar soldier left, promising to return someday under better circumstances, Mitchell remained at the memorial, thinking about the galaxy that humanity had entered. A galaxy full of ancient civilizations, powerful empires, species that had been traveling between stars when humans were still living in caves and hunting mammoths with sharpened sticks. And yet, in the one arena that ultimately mattered when push came to shove, humanity had proven itself equal or superior to them all. Not because humans were naturally violent or aggressive, though their history certainly suggested a talent for organized mayhem, but because humanity had been forced to become very, very good at survival in an environment that tried constantly to kill them. And warfare was just survival on a larger scale, just protection of the tribe expanded to encompass nations and species and ideologies. Across human space, from the inner colonies close to Earth to the frontier worlds on the edge of explored territory, life continued its normal rhythms. People went to work in offices and factories and farms. They raised families, pursued dreams, built futures. They argued about politics and sports and art. Most of them never thought about the military forces that protected them, never considered the shadowy operators who stood ready to defend humanity's interests in the dark places where official forces couldn't go. But those operators were always there, always training, always preparing. Special forces teams running exercises in hostile environments, learning to survive and thrive in jungles and deserts and frozen wastelands. Intelligence operatives gathering information on potential threats, analyzing capabilities and intentions, trying to predict where the next crisis would emerge. Quick reaction forces ready to deploy at a moment's notice to any corner of human space, to respond to disasters or hostilities or unexpected opportunities. And in the command centers where strategic decisions were made, where generals and admirals planned for contingencies that might never arise, human military planners studied the lessons of New Haven and dozens of other engagements. They analyzed what worked and what didn't, constantly refining their doctrine, always seeking ways to maximize their advantages and minimize their weaknesses. The galaxy had been put on notice through the events on New Haven and similar incidents. Humanity was not a species to be conquered. They were a species to be respected, to be negotiated with as equals, to be left alone if you valued your military forces and your strategic position. Because if you attacked humanity, if you pushed them into a corner and forced them to fight, you wouldn't face armies or fleets or divisions arrayed in glorious battle. You would face something far more dangerous, far more unpredictable, far more likely to find and exploit your every weakness. You would face their special forces, and by the time you realized what that truly meant, it would already be too late. The operators who defended New Haven had a saying, one that was repeated in special forces communities across human space, whispered in bars and training facilities, taught to new recruits as they learned their craft. It was simple, direct, and utterly true. Are everywhere and nowhere. We are the shadows between the stars, and if you threaten our people, we are the last thing you will never see. On New Haven, the sun set on another peaceful day. Children played in parks that had once been battlefields, laughing and running without fear. Shops sold goods on streets where Valkar tanks had burned and soldiers had died. Life had returned to normal, or as normal as life could be after your world had been invaded and your people had been forced to fight for survival. And in a small apartment overlooking the Memorial Park, Lieutenant Greg Hammond cleaned his rifle one more time before locking it away in its case. He had lesson plans to prepare for tomorrow's class, tests to grade, a normal life to live as a teacher and member of his community. But the rifle was always there, always ready. Because Hammond and thousands like him had made a promise, had taken an oath to defend humanity against all threats, foreign and domestic. That oath didn't expire when you went home to civilian life. It didn't fade when you returned to your regular job and your regular life. It was forever. That was what made them special forces. Not the training, not the equipment, not the tactics or strategies or any of the technical aspects of their profession. What made them special was the commitment, the unwavering dedication to stand between their people and whatever threatened them, no matter the cost, no matter the odds, no matter what personal sacrifices were required. The Valkar Empire learned that lesson at tremendous cost. The galaxy learned that lesson by observing what happened to the Valkar. And in the years that followed, as humanity continued to expand into the cosmos, as new colonies were established and new frontiers were explored, that lesson was reinforced again and again. Do not threaten humanity. Do not attack human colonies. Do not assume that because humans use relatively primitive technology or have smaller numbers that they are weak or vulnerable or easy prey. Because somewhere in the shadows, somewhere in the places you cannot see and cannot scan and cannot predict, humanity's special forces are watching. And if you cross the line, if you make them come for you, you will learn what it means to be hunted by the most dangerous predator the galaxy has ever known. A predator that walks on two legs, thinks with a brain evolved for pattern recognition and tool use and social cooperation, and has spent its entire evolutionary history learning to kill things bigger and stronger and faster than itself, through intelligence and teamwork and sheer bloody-minded persistence. The galaxy called them special forces, a clinical military term that described a specific type of unit. Humanity just called them necessary, a simple acknowledgement that someone had to stand watch, that someone had to be ready to fight when diplomacy failed and peace became impossible. And in the dark between the stars, they stood that watch, silent and unseen, the guardians of a species that had come late to the galactic community but had arrived with a message written in fire and blood and unshakable determination. We are human. We are here, and we will not be moved. 50 light years from New Haven, in a conference room aboard the Valkar flagship, senior military commanders gathered to discuss the implications of their defeat. The room was filled with veterans, officers who had conquered worlds, who had led campaigns across multiple star systems, who had never before tasted defeat. Now they sat in uncomfortable silence, reviewing tactical footage from New Haven that seemed to defy every principle they had been taught. Fleet Admiral Korthven activated the holographic display, showing a three-dimensional recreation of the battle. The blue markers representing Valkar forces were numerous, well-equipped, positioned according to doctrine. The red markers representing human defenders were sparse, scattered, seemingly insignificant. And yet, as the time lapse played out, the blue markers winked out one by one while the red markers danced through the city like ghosts. This engagement violated every tactical principle we understand, Korthven said, his voice carrying the weight of his years and experience. They had no appreciable defensive positions. They held no ground. They established no supply lines that we could interdict, and yet they defeated us decisively. One of the younger commanders, a rising star named Vextorian who had distinguished himself in the conquest of the Rill Confederacy, leaned forward. With respect, Admiral, perhaps the problem was our adherence to those principles. We fought as we always fight, overwhelming force, rapid occupation, establishment of control zones. The humans simply refused to fight that way. Refused. Another officer, older and more traditional, bristled at the suggestion. They had no choice. They lacked the forces to meet us in open battle. No, Vextorian said, pulling up additional data on his personal display. Analysis of their force composition suggests they deliberately chose this approach. They could have concentrated their forces, could have attempted to hold the spaceport or the government complex. Instead, they dispersed into small teams operating independently. This was not a last resort. It was their primary strategy. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The humans had chosen this method of warfare, had designed their military specifically to fight this way. It wasn't desperation or improvisation. It was doctrine. They have built an entire military philosophy around what they call asymmetric warfare, Vextorian continued, warming to his subject. The concept is simple but devastating. A smaller force with superior tactics and intimate terrain knowledge can defeat a larger force with superior technology. They have historical examples dating back thousands of years. Humans have been refining these methods for their entire recorded history. Fleet Admiral Korthven studied the younger officer with new interest. You have been researching human military history. Extensively, sir. The humans are remarkably open about their past conflicts. They publish detailed analyses of their wars, study them in their educational institutions, disseminate the lessons widely. I have reviewed hundreds of historical engagements. What we encountered on New Haven is merely the latest iteration of tactics they have employed for millennia. Show us, Korthven ordered. Vextorian activated a presentation he had been preparing, knowing this conversation would eventually come. Historical footage appeared, grainy and primitive by galactic standards, showing human conflicts from their pre-spaceflight era. Soldiers in crude uniforms moving through jungles, deserts, mountains. Small teams conducting raids behind enemy lines. Guerrilla forces harassing conventional armies. This footage is from their 20th century, a particularly violent period in human history. In this conflict, he highlighted one sequence, a technologically primitive force armed primarily with infantry weapons defeated the most powerful military machine of their era through the use of tactics very similar to what we encountered. Ambush, sabotage, exploitation of terrain, refusing to fight on their enemy's terms. He advanced the presentation, showing more examples. And this conflict. And this one, Again and again throughout their history, smaller forces have defeated larger ones through asymmetric methods. The humans have literally written the manual on this type of warfare. Another commander spoke up, his tone skeptical. But surely there are limits. Technology must count for something. We have energy weapons, they have chemical propellants. We have armor that can withstand. Their bullets penetrated our armor quite effectively, Vextorian interrupted gently. Because they targeted weak points and used specialized ammunition designed for armor penetration. They compensated for technological disadvantages through tactical superiority. Fleet Admiral Korthven stood, pacing the length of the conference room. Then how do we fight them? If conventional military doctrine is ineffective, what is the alternative? We don't fight them, sir. Vextorian's words hung in the air like a death sentence. Not unless we are willing to accept casualties on a scale that would be politically untenable. The humans have made it clear they do not seek conflict. They want to trade, to coexist peacefully. Our intelligence suggests they would be valuable allies if we can establish proper diplomatic relations. Allies, the traditional officer scoffed, with primitives who hide in shadows rather than fighting with honor. Honor is a concept that means different things to different species, Vextorian replied calmly. The humans have their own code of honor, their own values. They simply do not include standing in formation to be slaughtered when superior tactics are available. I would argue that this is pragmatic rather than dishonorable. On Earth, in a nondescript building in the mountains of Colorado, a similar meeting was taking place, though the tone was considerably different. General Patricia Hernandez, head of Special Operations Command, stood before a wall-sized display showing deployments across human space. Each dot represented a team, each cluster represented a concentration of capability. The map was impressive, and to those who understood its implications, somewhat terrifying. Current readiness stands at 97%, she reported to the assembled senior leadership, both civilian and military. All active teams have been briefed on the New Haven engagement and have incorporated lessons learned into their training protocols. We are prepared to deploy to any human colony within 72 hours of notification. Secretary of Defense William Chang studied the display with the expression of someone who bore the weight of civilization on his shoulders. New Haven was a decisive victory, no question, but it also revealed our capabilities to potential adversaries. Every military intelligence service in the galaxy is now analyzing what happened there, trying to determine our actual strength and develop countermeasures. Let them try, Hernandez said with a thin smile. The beauty of special operations is that we're constantly evolving. The tactics we used on New Haven are already being refined and improved. By the time potential adversaries develop counters, we'll be doing something completely different. Still, we should assume some loss of tactical surprise going forward, Chang insisted. The next engagement won't catch them off guard the way New Haven did. Hernandez nodded. Agreed. Which is why we're expanding our training to include scenarios where the enemy knows our playbook and has prepared accordingly. It forces our operators to be even more creative, even more adaptive. She pulled up another display, this one showing recruitment and training pipelines. We're also expanding capacity. Current force structure is adequate for defensive operations and limited offensive actions. But if we want to project power across our expanding territory, we need more teams. How many more? Asked Admiral Christopher Lloyd, representing Naval Special Warfare. Conservatively, double our current strength within 5 years. Aggressively, triple it within 7. The training pipeline is the limiting factor. We maintain extremely high standards because every operator needs to be capable of independent action. That takes time to develop. And the regular forces, this from General Marcus Williams, commanding conventional ground forces. How do we integrate special operations with traditional military doctrine? That's the challenge, Hernandez acknowledged. Special operations work best when they're the main effort. When we start using them as supporting elements for conventional forces, we lose much of their effectiveness. They're not force multipliers in the traditional sense. They're a completely different way of fighting. The discussion continued for hours. touching on everything from budget allocations to geopolitical implications. But underlying every conversation was the recognition that humanity had stumbled onto something profound. Their late arrival to the galactic stage, their relative technological backwardness, these perceived weaknesses had forced them to innovate in ways that more advanced species had never considered necessary. Back on New Haven, Sergeant Pete Donovan sat in a coffee shop near the spaceport, watching ships arrive and depart. The place had been rebuilt after the battle, modernized with some of the insurance money from the Valkar reparations. It was busier now, more prosperous. The invasion had put New Haven on the map, made it a destination for tourists and military historians alike. A young woman approached his table hesitantly. "Excuse me, are you Sergeant Donovan, one of the defenders?" Pete looked up from his coffee, recognizing the expression on her face. She was one of the pilgrims, as the locals called them, people who came to New Haven to meet the operators who had defended the colony. "I was," he said carefully. "I'm just Pete now, civilian contractor." "I wanted to thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "My family lives here, my nieces and nephews, if not for you and the others." "We were doing our job," Pete said, uncomfortable with the gratitude as he always was. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," the woman said firmly. "Not anyone, that's what makes you special." After she left, Pete sat alone with his coffee thinking about that word, special. It had started as a bureaucratic designation, a way to categorize certain types of military units. But it had taken on new meaning, especially after New Haven. Now when people said it, they meant something deeper, something about willingness to sacrifice, about standing between the innocent and those who would harm them. His comm unit buzzed. Text message from Hammond, "Team reunion next month." "You in?" Pete smiled and typed back. "Wouldn't miss it." The reunions had become annual events, a chance for the New Haven defenders to get together, share war stories, remember those who had served alongside them. Even though none of them had died in the battle, there was still a bond, a shared experience that civilians could never fully understand. In a luxury apartment on one of the core worlds, a Valkar civilian named Pexphalan watched a documentary about the New Haven incident. The program had been produced by a human media company, incorporating interviews with both Valkar survivors and human defenders. It was remarkably balanced, showing both perspectives, acknowledging mistakes on both sides. One particular interview caught Pexphalan's attention. It was with Staff Sergeant Linda Morris, the woman who had coordinated several of the key defensive actions. "People ask me if I was scared," Linda said to the interviewer. "Of course I was scared. We all were. 50,000 enemy soldiers against 47 of us. The math doesn't work in your favor, but fear is just information. It tells you that you're in danger, that you need to be careful. It doesn't tell you to give up." "What did tell you to keep fighting?" the interviewer asked. Linda was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Responsibility. Those civilians were depending on us. The children playing in parks, the families trying to build a life on a new world. They couldn't defend themselves against a military invasion, so that job fell to us. And once you accept that responsibility, fear becomes irrelevant. You do what needs to be done." Pexphalan found himself moved by her words. The Valkar Empire had always viewed military service as a duty, something you did because the state required it. But Linda was describing something different, something more personal. She had chosen to fight not because she was ordered to, but because others needed her protection. The documentary continued, showing tactical analysis of various engagements, explaining the methods the humans had used. Pexphalan, who had no military training, still found it fascinating. The humans had turned their city into a weapon, had used their intimate knowledge of the terrain to offset the Valkar's superior numbers and technology. Near the end, the documentary showed the memorial park, the wall with 47 names. The camera lingered on each name, giving viewers time to contemplate what those individuals had accomplished. "The New Haven incident changed galactic politics," the narrator concluded. "It demonstrated that technological superiority alone does not guarantee military victory. It showed that a determined, well-trained force fighting on familiar ground can defeat a much larger invader. Most importantly, It introduced the galaxy to humanity's special operations forces, warriors who operate by different rules and fight with methods that still confound traditional military thinkers. Pexvolan turned off the documentary and sat in contemplation. The Empire's defeat had seemed shameful at first, a national embarrassment. But viewing it through this lens, understanding what the humans had actually accomplished, it seemed less like defeat and more like education. The humans had taught the Valkyr a valuable lesson about the nature of warfare in the modern galaxy. Perhaps, Pexvolan thought, that lesson was worth the cost. In the training facilities scattered across human space, the next generation of special operators was being forged. Young men and women who had watched the New Haven footage 1,000 times, who had studied every engagement, every tactic, every decision. They ran through simulations where they were outnumbered 10 to 1, 20 to 1, 50 to 1. They learned to see every environment as a potential weapon, every disadvantage as an opportunity. Instructor Calvin Morris, Linda's brother, walked through a kill house where his students were practicing close-quarters battle. They moved with fluid precision, clearing rooms, identifying threats, making split-second decisions about when to shoot and when to hold fire. But Calvin could see the difference between competent and exceptional, and not all of these students would make the cut. "Hold," he called out, pausing the exercise. "Johnson, why did you enter that room from the left?" The student, still breathing hard from the adrenaline, thought about it. "Standard entry procedure, instructor. Left hand breach, right hand clear." And if the enemy knows standard entry procedures, if they're watching the same training videos you are, then you're predictable, and predictable gets you killed. Calvin reset the scenario. "Run it again. This time I want you to do something unexpected. Surprise me." This was the core of special operations training, teaching students to think rather than just react, to adapt rather than follow rote procedures. The students who graduated would be capable of independent action, of making command decisions in the field, of improvising when plans fell apart. Because plans always fell apart. Halfway across the galaxy, in the academic centers where military theory was studied and debated, professors were writing papers on the New Haven incident. Some argued it represented a fundamental shift in how warfare would be conducted in the future. Others insisted it was an anomaly, a specific set of circumstances that could not be replicated. All agreed that it demanded serious study. Professor Vikstaller, a renowned Catharian military theorist, presented her analysis to a packed auditorium. The humans succeeded because they fought an enemy who was unprepared for their methods. The Valkyr employed conventional invasion doctrine against an unconventional defense. The result was predictable once you understand the fundamental mismatch. She displayed tactical maps showing the progression of the battle. But notice something interesting. The humans did not fight to annihilate the Valkyr. They fought to impose unacceptable costs, to make continued occupation politically and militarily untenable. This shows strategic sophistication that belies their relatively short time on the galactic stage. A student raised a tentacle. "Professor, do you believe other species should adopt similar methods?" Vikstaller considered carefully. "Every species must develop military doctrine suited to their physiology, psychology, and strategic needs. What works for humans may not work for us." But the underlying principles, asymmetric warfare, exploitation of terrain knowledge, emphasis on operator initiative, these are universal concepts that any military can benefit from studying. She paused, looking out at her students. "The humans have reminded us of something we had forgotten in our pursuit of technological advancement, that warfare is fundamentally about will and determination as much as capability." They were willing to endure, to sacrifice, to fight on when the odds seemed impossible. That kind of determination cannot be countered with better weapons or more soldiers. It can only be respected. The lecture continued, but those words resonated through the academic community. Respect. Perhaps that was the most important lesson of New Haven. Humanity had earned respect not through displays of superior technology or grand demonstrations of power, but through simple, stubborn competence in the face of overwhelming odds. On a small moon orbiting a gas giant in neutral space, Representatives from multiple governments gathered for an informal summit. These were not official diplomatic channels, but back-channel communications, the kind of meetings that never appeared in public records. The topic was human military capability and how to respond to it. A Valerian delegate spoke first. The question before us is simple. Do the humans represent a threat to galactic stability? They have shown no aggressive intent, countered a Catharian. Their military actions have been entirely defensive in nature. So far, the Valerian emphasized. But power corrupts, as we all know. Give them another century of expansion, another few decades of military development, and will they still be content with defensive operations? An elderly Plexian, representing one of the galaxy's oldest civilizations, rasped a response. We faced this question 10,000 years ago when the Valkyr first emerged as a military power. We chose to contain them through alliance and deterrence. The result has been relative peace, with occasional flare-ups like the New Haven incident. I suggest we apply the same approach to humanity. Containment. The Valerian sounded skeptical. How do you contain a species whose primary military advantage is that they don't require conventional supply lines or force concentrations? You don't contain their military, the Plexian explained patiently. You contain their expansion through diplomatic means. Offer them trade partnerships, cultural exchanges, seats on galactic councils. Give them reasons to maintain the peace that don't involve military conflict. The discussion continued for hours, exploring various approaches. Some advocated for technological sharing to reduce the human advantage in asymmetric warfare. Others suggested establishing mutual defense pacts. A few, mostly younger delegates, proposed simply leaving humanity alone and hoping they remained peaceful. In the end, they reached a consensus of sorts, engagement rather than isolation. The galaxy would reach out to humanity, would include them in galactic affairs, would treat them as equals despite their technological disadvantages. It was a pragmatic decision based on military realities. Better to have the humans as friends than to force them into a position where they felt threatened. Back on Earth, in a modest home in suburban Maryland, Chief Petty Officer Kate Sullivan played with her daughter in the backyard. The little girl was 3 years old, completely unaware that her mother had destroyed 3 enemy satellites and helped secure orbital superiority during the Battle of New Haven. To her, Mom was just Mom, the person who made breakfast and read bedtime stories and pushed the swing in the backyard. Kate's husband, a civilian architect who had never served in the military, watched from the porch. He knew about Kate's service record, knew what she had done, but like most civilians, he couldn't quite grasp the scale of it. 3 satellites. It sounded so simple when stated that way. But each of those satellites had represented millions of credits in investment, had been critical to Valkyr command and control. Taking them out had blinded the enemy, had given the ground teams the freedom to operate. Higher, Mommy. The little girl squealed and Kate complied, pushing the swing with the same precise control she had once used to pilot a stealth fighter through hostile space. This was why they fought, Kate reflected. Not for glory or recognition or even patriotism, though those things mattered. They fought for moments like this, for children playing in backyards, for ordinary lives lived in peace. They fought so that others didn't have to. Her comm unit buzzed with a message. Classified briefing scheduled for next week. She would need to arrange childcare, would need to tell her husband she had government business without being able to explain the details. He never complained, but she knew it was hard on him, the secrecy and the absences. She made a decision then, watching her daughter swing higher and higher, shrieking with delight. After this next deployment cycle, she would retire from active service. She had given enough years to the military, had done her part to keep humanity safe. It was time to let the next generation carry that burden. But she would keep current on her qualifications, would maintain her clearances, just in case. Because that was the thing about being special forces, you might leave the service, but the service never quite left you. The training, the mindset, the willingness to act when others froze, those things stayed with you forever. Across the galaxy, similar scenes were playing out. Veterans returning to civilian life, carrying invisible scars and classified memories. New recruits entering training, eager to prove themselves worthy of the same units that had defended New Haven. Politicians and diplomats trying to navigate a new galactic reality where humanity punched far above its weight class. And always, the small teams of operators training, preparing, standing ready. Because the galaxy was a dangerous place, and humanity had learned that hard lesson well before they left Earth. There were predators out there, species and organizations that would take what they wanted if no one stopped them. And humanity had decided, collectively if not always consciously, that they would be the ones doing the stopping. Not through conquest or empire building, but through carefully calibrated applications of force designed to make aggression too costly to contemplate. It was a strategy as old as civilization: peace through strength, security through deterrence, safety through the willingness to fight when necessary. The Memorial Park on New Haven had become more than just a monument to 47 defenders. It had become a symbol of humanity's place in the galaxy, a reminder that technology and numbers weren't everything, that determination and skill and tactical brilliance could still turn the tide of battle. Tourists came from across human space to see it, to touch the names carved in black granite, to remember. School children came on field trips, learned about the battle, discussed the ethics and tactics and implications. Veterans came to pay their respects, to remember comrades who had fought in different battles but shared the same spirit. And sometimes, late at night when the park was empty, one of the 47 would return. They would stand before the wall, seeing their own name alongside their teammates, remembering those desperate weeks when the galaxy's eyes were upon them and they could not afford to fail. They had not failed. They had won decisively, had changed the course of human history, had announced to the galaxy that humanity would not be easy prey. And in doing so, they had carved their names not just in granite but in the collective memory of their species. They were special forces. They were guardians, protectors, warriors operating in shadows and striking from darkness. They were the reason humanity could sleep safely at night, could build colonies on distant worlds, could look to the stars with hope rather than fear. And they would always be ready, always vigilant, always standing between humanity and whatever threats emerged from the vast darkness of space. Because that was what they had promised to do, what they had trained to do, what they were willing to die to do if necessary. The galaxy had been warned. The galaxy had learned. And the galaxy gave humanity the space and respect that such capability demanded. Because no one wanted to face humanity's special forces again. Once had been quite enough.